Welcome back. Today we'll be talking about process costing and covering Chapter 3. The learning objectives for this chapter is to discuss the uses of a process cost system and how it compares to a job order cost system, explain the flow of cost in a process cost system and the journal entries to assign manufacturing cost, compute equivalent units of production, and complete the 4 steps to prepare a production cost report. Uses of a process cost system are to assign costs to similar products that are mass-produced in a continuous fashion. Examples include producing cereal, paint, soft drinks, as well as manufacturing steel and refining oil. So it's any manufacturing process where the outcome is a product that you can't really differentiate, and it's almost a continuous production cycle that they're going through. That's different than what we learned in Chapter 2 with the job order cost system. So if you look on the right, we talked about some of these things in Chapter 2 that are a job order cost system is good for. So making movies, you've got a finite product at the end. Advertising, you've got different campaigns. At the bottom there, patient health care. We talked about that a little bit in Chapter 2, that it's set for a job order cost system. And then on the left, some examples of products that are better used under a process cost system. So soft drinks, oil, computer chips, chemicals, where it's kind of a homogeneous output and you can't differentiate the final product one from another. So which of the following items is not a characteristic of a process cost system? The answer is D. The products produced are heterogeneous in nature. That is not a characteristic of a process cost system. That would be more of a job cost system. Service companies that provide individualized, non-routine services will probably benefit from using a job order cost system, but those that perform routine, repetitive services will probably be better off with a process cost system. Here are some similarities and differences between the two the cost systems. Job order costs are assigned to each job. Products have unique characteristics. We talked about that in Chapter 2. Process costs are tracked through a series of manufacturing process or departments. The products are uniform or relatively homogeneous and produced in large volume. This top graphic is what we looked at in Chapter 2 again with the job order cost flow. We had direct materials, direct labor, manufacturing overhead. It went to work in process, and we had one account, work in process inventory, with multiple jobs within that account. Once a job was finished, it went to finished goods inventory, and then once sold, into cost of goods sold. Under a process cost flow at the bottom, we still have the same inputs, direct materials, direct labor, manufacturing overhead, but it's going to go to a work in process inventory for Department A, then potentially to work in process Department B. Some additional costs could come into that department. It's not a linear flow necessarily. Once the product is completed, it goes to finished goods inventory, and it sits in that inventory account until it's sold, and then the costs go to our cost of goods sold account. So the similarities of the two manufacturing cost components. So we're dealing with direct labor, direct materials, and overhead. We're going to accumulate those costs, and the flow of costs are the same. It goes from the generation of those costs or the purchases, and then into work in process, then finished goods, then cost of goods sold. The difference is the number of work in process inventory accounts used. So under a process cost system, you could have different work in process accounts for different departments or different processes. The documents used to track costs are different. The point at which costs are totaled is at a different time, and the unit cost computations is different. And we'll see some of that later in the chapter. Again, here's some summary of the major differences. Work in process inventory accounts, job order cost system, there's one. Process costs, there's multiple. The documents used, the job order cost system has job cost sheets. The process cost system has production cost reports. Determination of total manufacturing costs, job order costs, it's each job. So whether it ends at the end of the period or in the middle of the period, at the end of the job, that's when you total the cost. Process cost system, it's at the end of each period. And unit cost computations, it's the cost of each job divided by the units produced for that job to get a unit cost under a job cost system. Under a process cost system, it's the sum of materials and conversion costs, each divided by the respective equivalent units. And a little bit later, we'll talk about how to calculate that and what equivalent units actually means. Some true or false questions. So a law firm is likely to use process costing for major lawsuits. False. They'd be better off using a job cost. A manufacturer of paintballs is likely to use process costing. That is true. The output is pretty homogeneous, and it's a more continuous production process, so process cost system would be best. Both job order and process costing determine product cost at the end of a period of time rather than when a product is completed. That is false. Process costing is at the end of the period. Job order is at the end of the job. Finally, process costing does not keep track of manufacturing overhead. That is false. That is one of the inputs and one of the cost calculations that we do in both job cost and process cost. So now that we've talked about the similarities and differences of job costing and process costing, we'll explain the flow of cost in a process cost system and then the journal entries. Tyler Company manufactures rollerblade and skateboard wheels that it sells to manufacturers and retail outlets. Manufacturing consists of two processes, machining and assembly. The machining department shapes, hones, and drills the raw materials. The assembly department assembles and packages the wheels. So we'll look at an illustration of how these costs get assigned to the different accounts. So the manufacturing costs are accumulated like we saw in the job costing system, no difference there. So raw materials are purchased and debited to the raw materials inventory. Factory labor, when incurred, gets assigned to the factory labor account, and then manufacturing overhead, when incurred, gets put into the manufacturing overhead account. As work gets done in the machining department, there's raw materials that get sent to that department, so into that work in process account. As it uses factory labor and overhead, those are assigned and moved to that department as well. Then when it moves to the assembly department, costs move from work in process machining to work in process assembly. There can be additional labor, overhead, and materials used. Once the job is complete, it moves from the work in process assembly to the finished goods inventory account, and then once sold, gets transferred to the cost of goods sold account. The accumulation of cost, direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead is the same as job order cost systems, so no difference there than what we saw in Chapter 2. The assignment of manufacturing cost to work in process in a process cost system is different than in a job order cost system. Material cost, a process cost system requires fewer material requisition slips than job order cost system. Materials are used for processes and not specific jobs. And requisitions are for larger quantities of materials. Go through an example. Tyler Company adds materials at the beginning of each process. Suppose at the beginning of the current period that Tyler adds $50,000 of direct materials to the machining process and $20,000 of direct materials to the assembly process. Tyler makes the following entry to record the direct materials used. Similar to the job cost system we saw, we're going to debit our work in process account, but in this case we're splitting it between, not between jobs, but between departments. So work in process machining gets the $50,000, work in process assembly is debited $20,000, and a credit of $70,000 to raw materials inventory. Factory labor costs. Time tickets may be used in both systems. All labor costs incurred within a production department are a cost of processing. Again, we'll look at Tyler Company. They incur factory labor charges of $20,000 in the machining process and $13,000 in the assembly process. The entry to assign these direct labor costs to machining and assembly for Tyler is debit the work in process accounts. Machining gets debited $20,000, assembly $13,000, and we credit the factory labor of $33,000. Remember, just like in a job cost system, when we incur the cost or pay the payroll, we debit that factory labor account. So the same concept, that same account, and then as we use that in our processes, we assign it to the work in process machining or work in process assembly accounts. Manufacturing overhead. The objective of assigning overhead is to allocate overhead to production departments on an objective and equitable basis. Use activity that drives or causes costs. Machine time used is a primary driver. So if you remember in the job cost system we talked about in Chapter 2, we used labor cost or labor hours because that was a good driver. In a process cost system, machine time is a good example of one that is used primarily. But again, depending on the process and the company, that can be different as long as it's consistent within that company or within that process, and it allocates costs in a systematic way and it's equitable. Assume that based on machine hours that Tyler Company assigns overhead of $45,000 to the machining process and $17,000 to the assembly process. The entry is going to be debit work in process machining $45,000, debit work in process assembly $17,000, and the credit to manufacturing overhead of $62,000. Suppose Tyler transferred goods with a recorded cost of $87,000 from machining to assembly. Tyler makes the following entry. Debit work in process assembly, $87,000. Credit work in process machining, $87,000. So we've accumulated costs in machining. We also had some direct costs into assembly and overhead costs into both. Now we're done with the machining process. We're going to take those goods and transfer them to machining to be finished, or from machining to assembly to get assembled and packaged up, so we can move those costs with this journal entry into that department. The assembly department completes units with a recorded cost of $114,000 and then transfers them to the finished goods warehouse. That entry looks like this. We're going to debit finished goods inventory $114,000, credit work in process assembly $114,000. And then finally, when we sell goods, in this case, we're selling finished goods with a recorded cost of $27,000. The cost of goods sold entry is like we've seen before, debit cost of goods sold, credit finished goods inventory. As part of the sale, you'd also have accounts receivable and sales revenue, but we're ignoring that in this example. Another review question. In making entries to assign raw material costs, a company using process costing it often increases two or more work in process accounts. So assigning raw material costs out of raw material. So we're going to credit raw material. Our debit is to work in process. Typically at the end of the period, we've made raw materials, direct materials into multiple departments. So we're going to use multiple work in process accounts. Let's go through another example. Ruth Company manufactures Zeebo through two processes, blending and bottling. In June, direct materials used were blending 18,000 and bottling 4,000. Direct labor costs were blending 12,000 and bottling 5,000. Manufacturing overhead costs assigned were blending 6,000, bottling 2,500. The blending department transfers units completed at a cost of 19,000 to the bottling department. The bottling department transfers units completed at a cost of 11,000 to finished goods. Journalize the assignment of these costs to the two processes and transfer of units as appropriate. So we'll break these down and go step through them and come up with the journal entries. So first we'll look at direct materials. So blending used 18,000, bottling 4,000. We're going to debit the work in process accounts, blending 18,000, bottling 4,000, credit raw materials inventory 22,000. To assign direct labor to production, remember direct labor costs were blending 12,000, bottling 5,000. Again, debit the two work in process accounts, blending for 12,000, bottling for 5,000, credit factory labor for 17,000. Finally, to assign overhead to production, manufacturing overhead costs assigned were blending 6,000, bottling 2,500. Again, debit the two work in process accounts for those amounts, and then credit the manufacturing overhead 8,500. We transferred units from blending to bottling at a cost of 19,000. That entry is debit work in process bottling 19,000. So we're increasing the bottling work in process account. Credit the work in process blending. We're decreasing that because we're transferring the units from blending to bottling. And then to record the transfer of units to finished goods, the 11,000 that the bottling department transferred, we debit finished goods inventory 11,000, credit work in process bottling 11,000. So that's how, if we had the total amounts for those categories that we talked about, direct materials, direct labor, overhead, and then transferring between departments, we can complete the journal entries that way. A lot of times, though, you need to know the number of units as well, and we'll talk about computing the equivalent units of production. Suppose you have a work-study job in the office of your college president. She asks you to compute the cost of instruction per full-time equivalent student in your college. The college's vice president for finance provides the following information. The cost, so the annual cost of instruction is $9 million. And the student population, we have 900 full-time students and 1,000 part-time students. Then you find out that the part-time students take 60% of the classes of full-time student during the year. Compute the number of full-time equivalent students per year. Okay, so what we're doing with the equivalent units is trying to equate a unit basis so that they can achieve the same unit cost or apply the same unit cost per those units. Applying the same unit cost to 1,000 students part-time doesn't really make sense, because the full-time students in this example actually take up more resources. So we have to convert it to equivalent units. So the way we do that is full-time students 900. We're going to keep it at 900. The equivalent units of part-time students, we're going to take that 1,000 students, since they take 60% of the classes of a full-time student, we'll multiply by 60%. That gives us our 600. Add that to the 900. We have 1,500 equivalent students. And then to get cost per student, you take the total cost of instruction divided by that 1,500 full-time equivalent students to get $6,000 per student. So where that equivalent unit or equivalent students in this example is less than the total number of students. We have 1,900 students, but to get an equivalent level, to get cost per student, we have to figure in the percent of classes taken in this case, and we have a smaller number than 1,500. The weighted average method, it considers the degree of completion or weighting of units completed and transferred out and units in ending work in process. So just like we looked at on the student basis, the percent of classes taken, we look at the percent of completion to weight these units. This is the most widely used method, and beginning work in process is not part of computation of equivalent units. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at units completed and transferred out, plus the equivalent units of ending work in process. And that's going to give us our equivalent units of production. We can use that to compare against the total cost to get a equivalent cost per unit. So the entire output of Sullivan Company's blending department resulted in an ending work in process of 4,000 units, which are 60% complete as to materials, labor, and overhead. Calculate the equivalent units of production. So we had no completed units. We have 4,000 units, 60% complete, so 2,400 equivalent units. So Kellogg Company has produced Eggo waffles since 1970. 3 departments produce these waffles: mixing, baking, and freezing packaging. The mixing department combines dry ingredients, including flour, salt, and baking powder, with liquid ingredients, including eggs and vegetable oil, to make waffle batter. The following information related to the mixing department at the end of June. So we have physical units, work in process at the beginning of June, the number of units started in production, total units to be accounted for. So in this case, we started with 100,000 units. We started production on 800,000 units. So we have 900,000 that we have to account for. The units completed and transferred out were 700,000. The work in process June 30th is 200,000. So we've accounted for 900,000. Now we have to the right our work in process at the beginning and our work in process ending, what percent complete they are as it relates to direct materials and conversion costs. So in both cases, direct materials were 100% complete. Our beginning work in process was only 70% complete on conversion costs, and at the end of June, our work in process ending was only 60% complete as to conversion costs. So if we look at equivalent units, 700,000 were completed and transferred out. So both materials and conversion costs get the 700,000. Work in process. Again, we ignore our beginning work in process. That's not part of this equivalent units calculation. We had 200,000 units, 100% complete to materials, so they get 200,000, so 900,000 of equivalent units of materials. Conversion costs of the 200,000 units in ending inventory, ending work in process inventory, they were only 60% complete. So 60% of 200,000, 120,000 units. So conversion cost equivalent units was 820,000. Conversion costs are the sum of direct labor and manufacturing overhead. So we separate our direct materials and then combine direct labor and manufacturing overhead to get our conversion costs. So units completed and transferred out for materials plus equivalent units of ending work in process materials is our equivalent units of production materials, and units completed and transferred out for conversion costs plus equivalent units of ending work in process conversion costs is our equivalent units of production costs. So we can have different equivalent units for materials and conversion costs, and that's pretty common. So let's look at a review question. The mixing department's output during the period consists of 20,000 units completed and transferred out, 5,000 units in ending work in process, 60% complete as to direct material and conversion costs. Beginning inventory is 1,000 units, 40% complete as to direct materials and conversion costs. The equivalent units of production are oops, sorry about that. And the answer is 23,000 units. How did we get that 23,000 units? We had 20,000 units completed and transferred out, plus 3,000 equivalent units ending inventory, which is our 5,000 units given in the problem at 60% complete. So 23,000 equivalent units of production. So another example here, the fabricating department for outdoor essentials has the following production and cost data for the current month. Beginning work in process 0, units completed and transferred out 15,000, ending work in process 10,000 units. All direct materials are entered at the beginning of the process. The ending work in process units are 30% complete as to conversion costs. Compute the equivalent units of production for materials and conversion costs. So first we'll look at materials. We start with our units completed and transferred out, 15,000. And then we look at our equivalent units of ending work in process, 10,000 units. Since the materials are put into the beginning of the process, at the beginning of the period, we say they're 100% complete. So we take all 10,000 units, so 25,000 equivalent units for materials. For conversion costs, again, we start with the 15,000 completed and transferred out, but for ending work in process, we have to take a percentage. In this case, we learned that they were 30% complete as to the ending work in process. So 30% of the 10,000 is 3,000. Add that to the 15,000 completed and transferred out. 18,000 is our equivalent units for conversion costs. Now we'll look at these steps to complete the production cost report. The production cost report is a key document to understand activities. It's prepared for each department and shows production quantity and cost data. So we're going to compute the physical unit flow, then compute the equivalent units of production, which we just learned about. Then we'll compute the unit production costs using those equivalent units, and then prepare a cost reconciliation schedule. So the flow of costs to make Eggo waffle and the related production cost reports for each department. So direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead can go to each of those processes. Then each department or each process is going to have its own production cost report. So we'll look at the mixing department again. The physical units, we had 100,000 work in process units on June 1st. We started 800,000 units into production during June. We had 700,000 units completed and transferred to the baking department. We had 200,000 units in work in process at the end of June. 100% complete for direct materials, 60% complete for conversion costs. On the cost side, we had $50,000 from direct materials in beginning work in process, 35,000 of conversion costs, so $85,000 in work in process at beginning of June. Then we had direct materials of 400,000, conversion costs of 170 incurred during production in June, so 570,000 costs incurred in June. So if we compute the physical flow, physical units are the actual units to be accounted for during a period, regardless of the state of completion. Total units to be accounted for is the units started or transferred into production during the period, plus units in production at beginning of period. Total units accounted for are the units transferred out during the period and units in process at the end of the period. So in the mixing department example, we started with 100,000 in work in process. We started 800,000 into production, so we have to account for 900,000 units. We completed and transferred out 700,000 units. We had 200,000 in work in process as of June 30th, so we've accounted for the 900,000 units. Equivalent units of production. The department adds materials at beginning of process and incurs conversion costs uniformly during the process. So we would take those 900,000 units for materials that's the equivalent units, since the 200,000 in work in process are at 100% for materials. And the conversion cost, we had the 700,000 completed and transferred out, plus the ending of 200,000 units were 60% complete. So 60% of the 200,000, 120,000 gives us our 820,000 equivalent units for conversion costs. So now that we have total units, our total costs, and our equivalent units, we can compute the unit production costs. It's expressed in terms of equivalent units of production. When equivalent units of production are different for direct materials and conversion cost, 3 unit costs are computed, 1 for materials, 1 for conversion, and 1 for total manufacturing. So we'll look at materials first. We had 50,000 direct material costs beginning work in process. We added 400,000 of direct material costs, so we had 450,000 total costs. Total cost divided by equivalent units of 900,000, we get a unit materials cost of 50 cents. When we look at total conversion costs for this period, we started with 35,000 in conversion costs work in process. We added 170,000 to production in June, 170,000 in conversion costs, so we had $205,000 of total conversion costs. We divide that by the equivalent units for conversion costs that we calculated. That's the 820,000 units. And we get a unit conversion cost of $25,000. Finally, we'll get the total manufacturing cost per unit. It's simply adding the two unit costs together, 50 cents for material, 25% for conversion costs. Total manufacturing cost per unit is 75 cents. Now we'll look at the cost reconciliation schedule. The cost charged to the mixing department. They charged a total of $655,000 to the mixing department. So we had 85,000 work in process June 1st, 570 started in production, so we had total cost of 655,000. If we use our unit cost we calculated, 75 cents, we multiply that times the number of units completed and transferred out. That gives us $525,000 completed and transferred out. Work in process, we use the individual unit cost that we calculated. So materials, since they're 100% complete, 200,000 units at 50 cents, $100,000 there. The conversion cost, 120,000 units in ending inventory. That's the equivalent units, remember, times 25 cents per unit, $30,000 in work in process at the end of June. So 130,000 total work in process, plus our 525,000 completed and transferred out, $655,000 of cost accounted for. So if we flip back again, we had $655,000 cost to be accounted for. We account for those for what was completed and transferred out, 525,000 in this example, plus what's in ending work in process, 130,000. That's our 655,000, so we've accounted for all the costs. And then here's an example of the complete production cost report. Up at the top, we have the quantities, so units to be accounted for. Then we do that on an equivalent basis to get our equivalent units accounted for. We have our total costs, our equivalent units, our unit costs. Then we have our total cost to be accounted for. And then the cost accounted for, whether we transferred it out or if it's still in work in process. Another review question. Largo Company has unit costs of $10 for direct materials, $30 for conversion costs. If there are 2,500 units in ending work in process, 40% complete as to conversion costs and fully complete as to material costs, the total cost assignable to the ending work in process inventory is the answer is $55,000. How did we get that? Our direct materials is $10 per unit, 100% complete, so we use full 2,500 units, so $25,000 of direct materials cost. Conversion costs, $30 per unit. Since it's only 40% complete, the equivalent units are 2,500 times 40%, 1,000 units, so $30,000 of conversion costs, $55,000 total costs. Companies often use a combination of process cost and job order cost system. So they could have some homogeneous stuff that they do, so they're using a process cost. They may have some more individualized products that they want to use a job order cost, so they can use a combination. Called operation costing, this hybrid system is similar to process costing in its assumption that standardized methods are used to manufacture the product. The product may have some customized individual features that require use of a job order cost system. So let's look at a cost reconciliation example. In March, Rodeo Manufacturing had the following unit production costs in its assembly department. Material $6, conversion costs $9. On March 1st, it had no work in process. During March, the assembly department completed and transferred out 12,000 units. As of March 30th, 800 units that were 25% complete to conversion cost, 100% complete as to materials were in ending work in process in the assembly department. Assign the cost to the units completed and transferred out into the work in process at the end of the month. So for the units completed and transferred out, it's 12,000 units. We take the material cost per unit plus the conversion cost per unit. So 6 plus 9, $15 times the 12,000 units. That'll give us what was completed and transferred out. And then the work in process, we're going to use for materials the $6 times the 800 units times the percent complete, 100% for materials. For conversion cost, the $9 per unit times the 800 units times the percent complete to get conversion costs. So we have $186,600 total cost accounted for. Well, they didn't give us the cost to be accounted for, so we can't compare to that, but this is just looking at how we break down once we have unit costs and percent complete and the number of units, we can calculate the total cost accounted for. Okay, that's it for Chapter 3. Continue working on your homework. Get that completed by the end of the week. And if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.